hypotonic. So why don't you give me a value for this solution?
1.2.
1.2, 1.0, as long as it's where? Below 1.5, good. So anything below 1.5 works as a hypotonic solution. And in this case, the cell says, oh, you know what, I'm not in equilibrium or homeostasis with my environment. I want to be just the same. So water can move to equalize solute concentrations. So here's the trick. Does water move into your cell or out of your cell? Into your cell. If you never quite click with this in Bio 210, one thing to do is think about the fact that we have more solutes inside. The higher number, of course, is representing those more solutes. The water always flows from the lower value of solute concentration to the higher value of solute concentration. Sure, water always flows from the lower solute concentration to the area's higher solute concentration. So you probably remember from Bio 210 a phrase that's commonly used, water follows salt. So if wherever you have the most salt, and I mean ions here in general, that's where the water is going to travel to equalize solute concentration. In hypotonic situations, what happens to the size of the cell?
Bloat.
Bloat. And you've probably heard the trick before that hypo, O, and bloat sound kind of the same, so there's a good clue to remembering that in the hypotonic environment, cells will bloat.
Hypodipper.
Hypodipper, that's good. That's good, I hadn't heard that one.
You can always just point an arrow to the larger number,
Yep,
and that's where the water will go.
exactly, because the larger number is going to be your cell this time, so that works every single time. Obviously, if you put a cell in a more concentrated solution, this time we've got the flip side happening. Hypertonic. So if our solution is hypertonic to the cell, give me a number. Yeah, anything higher than 1.5, so I heard somebody say 2, so let's go with that one. And that trend always works. If you draw an arrow to the higher number, that's where water's going to travel. The goal of that water movement is to equalize solute concentration. So water leaves the cell here in favor of going to the extracellular environment. So we know that hypertonic solutions that contain more solutes will promote what happening to your cell?
Shriveling.
Shriveling. What are your clues to remember hypertonic and shrivel? The E's? That's good. What else do you use?
The numbers, of course.
The numbers, yeah, that will work too. And I always think if you've got hyper kids in your house, you want to open the door and let them leave. Water leaves in hypersonic solutions. So yeah, cells going to shrivel, water leaves. So the bottom line is, we're not going to mess with any more isotonic situations. We're going to talk about what happens when you alter the environment around the cell. So we need to keep in mind that if the solution around your cell is hypotonic, the cell will bloat. And if you have excess fluid around your cell, we call that what?
Hypertonic.
Hypertonic or edema. You know, where you said you've got excess fluid, your cells will swell. And this situation here, having fluid leave your cells, that fluid hops in the bloodstream ultimately. It's gone because your kidneys get rid of it, right? So in cases of hypertonic solutions, we're typically talking about some situation that promotes dehydration. So we've got edema with hypotonic. hypertonic solutions promote dehydration. Now, take you back to chapter 19 for just a moment. This is going back to the process of filtration and reabsorption. Back in chapter 19, we talked about capillaries and how capillaries can actually be involved in fluid, flows into and out of the capillaries. I'm going to start you down here at the arterial end of your capillary, and of course down here is going to be the venial end. So which end of your capillary are we experiencing filtration?
Arterial.
Arterial end, good. What is filtration?
Water leaves the capillary into the cells.
Good. Water leaves the capillary. It comes out here into the cells. You might recall that we talked about two types of fluids, or two types of pressures, rather, that are battling at that arterial end. We have something called HP, hydrostatic, good. There is hydrostatic pressure out here. It's nominal, it's negligible, it really has no overall contribution to the battle that's happening here inside the capillary. Back in chapter 19, we called this HPC because it was hydrostatic pressure of the capillary. In this chapter, we tend to call it the same thing, but we put a B in front for blood hydrostatic pressure. Hey, this is still blood pressure, right? Hydrostatic pressure wins the battle because hydrostatic pressure is high enough at the arterial end to successfully push out enough fluid at this area of the capillary. We also talked about OP. What is OP? Good, osmotic pressure. Is osmotic pressure pushing out fluids, or what's creating that pull?
Proteins.
Proteins and solutes, good. So proteins and solutes are going to be attracted to returning to this capillary, but at the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure is greater than osmotic pressure. We also call it BOP for blood osmotic pressure. So at your arterial end, you might recall that hydrostatic pressure, now known as BHP, is actually going to be greater than osmotic pressure. So the push of fluids out is going to be greater than the pull of fluids back in. So that means that we are going to push fluids into the surrounding cells and tissues. Do you recall the net filtration pressure at the arterial end?
10.
10. Yeah, good.
Good girl.
And the venial end, what are we looking at? Yep, actually it's a -8. What wins the battle at that venial end? Osmotic, yeah. So at your venial end, we're going to experience reabsorption of those fluids as long as BOP is greater than BHP. BOP is the pull created by solutes and proteins back into the capillary. BHP is the push of fluids out. Since the overall value is a negative 8 millimeters mercury, the overall pull is to return those fluids into the capillary. This is an ideal situation, and of course that's not what we're dealing with today. Let's mess up the situation and figure out how that affects everything. So what I've got for you over on page 132 is a chart that you can use when doing 133 as homework. Let's talk about that top left box that says BHP. Okay, there's two things to keep in mind here. Keep in mind that BHP is the same thing as hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure. And blood pressure is dependent primarily on how much fluid you have in the bloodstream.
You're talking about plasma, right?
Yeah, plasma. Situations that alter the amount of blood volume you have can, of course, alter your BHP. That was scary, wasn't it?
It sounded like wind blowing.
It did. Oh, roller coaster ride. BOP, you might recall, is osmotic pressure of the blood. This depends on how many sites and proteins you have in the plasma. So we're looking at having a balance between those two because our goal here is to filter out water at the arterial end but reabsorb it at the venial end.